Good evening. How are you? It's good to see. If I take my glasses off, I can see you. A lot of
Excuse me.
familiar. Oh yeah, go for it, Barry. We got it. Well, welcome to the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum, the 2024 Summer Lecture Series. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Susan Sprake. I'm the president of the forum this year. And it's been a real honor working with our speakers and our guests, and I'm just really happy to see all of you here this evening. We have a let me know if you can't hear me. I'm nervous about moving too far away from the microphone. Um, our upcoming schedule, as you see, next week we have Dr. Stephen Collins, our archaeologist. He was with us last summer and he told us about how he found Sodom and Gomorrah, and he used biblical references, which he got a lot of negative response from other archaeologists saying, you shouldn't be doing that. We already know where it is and you're wrong. Well, he found it and he used biblical references. He'll be coming back this next week and he's going to take us on another journey that will involve what do we know about the Exodus and what have they discovered in that regard. So that'll be kind of interesting. He's going to be talking about some interesting scientific instruments that I hope we will all learn a little bit about. So I'm excited to see that. On July 9th, we'll have Kirk Wiesbrod here. July 16th, Nels Hoffman, wherever you are, Nels. There he is. July 23rd, we will have a very special invited speaker, Dr. Andrew Newberg. He's a neurologist, but he wants to be referred to as a neurotheologist. And he's going to be talking about the mapping of the brain under a variety of different states, meditation, prayer, and he has a new book coming out in August about some of the work that they've done regarding sexuality and the mapping of the brain and what it shows when people are in different states. He's going to try and be able to bring some copies of his new book if he can get the publisher to allow him to do that. And I will send out an email to folks as soon as I know if we're going to be able to sell some of his books while he's here. Following Dr. Newberg, we'll have Dr. Roy Hill. Dr. Roy Hill is a chaplain at a prison facility up in Colorado, and he has written a number of books on near-death experiences. He began to have some curious interactions with some of the prisoners, and he's going to tell you about what sparked that curiosity. And he began to look at the statistics behind near-death experiences and what it was telling him. And he has not had a near-death experience. I know some people in this audience have, but he has an incredible array of statistics for us to look at. And we will have some discussions with him on either your personal experience or your questions about the science. Then following that, we have John Ambrosiano, who's somewhere, I don't know where you are, John. Over there, hey. And he will wrap up our summer, and he's going to be talking about knowledge and certainty, and how do we know what we come to know, and do we know what we think we know, or do we not know anything at all? It's a very interesting presentation, so I invite you all to be here on August 6th. Now this evening, we have a brand new person to Los Alamos. Oh, wait, that's somebody else. Yeah. Anyway, this is a brief a write-up about what. Now, do you want to be called Rabbi Physicist? You want to be called Jack? I know you want to be called Jack, but do you want Rabbi Physicist Jack, or Physicist Rabbi Jack? Just Jack. Okay. Well, he's going to take us through a little bit of a scenario on anti-Semitism and anti-science, a deadly overlap in the case of the missing hyphen? Question mark, question mark. So we look forward to hearing that. I think you all can read that. Do I need to leave it up there for another moment? Going once, going twice. We got it. Okay, we don't know Jack very well, but it's rumored that he's been a physicist who has worked here at the lab for over 30 years with some brief stints at Brookhaven in New York and at the Atomic Energy Agency and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, the latter two based in Vienna, Austria. In parallel, Jack was ordained, see, he's so new, I don't know his name, you know? Wait, aren't most people named John and then their nickname, but not you? Oh, okay, you're different. Okay. Jack was ordained as a rabbi in 1995. He was the rabbi and spiritual leader for the Jewish congregation in Los Alamos for many years and was the rabbi in Center Mauritius, New York. Did I say that right? Close? Mauritius. Okay. And during his years in Brookhaven, and now serves as a rabbi of Hachmakan, close, a congregation in Santa Fe, as well as the Los Alamos Jewish Center. He has also provided iterate rabbinic support to far-flung Jewish communities, including those in Vienna, Austria, and Beijing, China. Please join me in welcoming Jack Schlachter, who we all know well.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's really an honor to be part of this Faith and Science series, and it is a great pleasure to work with Susan in preparing for these talks. So let's give her a round of applause. So I wanted to take a little spin off of the title of the series, Faith and Science, and make this kind of an anti-faith, anti-science talk. And so I titled it deliberately Anti-Semitism and Anti-Science. But as you see in the title, I left the hyphen out of the word anti-Semitism. So I'm not going to give a sermon this evening. If you would like to hear a sermon about anti-Semitism, I've given one at multiple churches in town, and I'm giving that same sermon at another church in town next month because I'm quite focused on the very significant rise in anti-Semitism in this country and elsewhere. And I think it's a problem that needs to be addressed. When I give those sermons, I make it clear to people that the Jewish community cannot solve that problem on our own, and I give those sermons in part because we need allies. So if you'd like just the 30-second version of that sermon, we need you to be our allies to fight anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism is really, it's a misnomer. The word really should be Jew hatred. Because there is no Semitism for which people are anti whatever Semitism is. That's why I leave the hyphen out. And many scholars do that deliberately to show that anti-Semitism is just a concept and really should be called Jew hatred. I'm not going to dwell a lot on its origins or even what we might do to combat it. But it turns out that anti-science really is a hyphenated thing. We know what science is. Of all places on the planet, probably Los Alamos knows better than anybody what science is. Anti-science, according to Professor Peter Hotez, involves the rejection of mainstream scientific views and methods or their replacement with unproven or deliberately misleading theories, often for nefarious and political gains. So it's not something that we come across so often directly, I hope, in Los Alamos, but it is something that is a phenomenon. And what I wanted to do this evening was really try to be entertaining, not to be polemic. Like I said, if you want to come to a sermon, you're welcome to do that. But I found 5 examples of what I would call overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-science, and I thought you might find it interesting to review those 5, some of which you may be familiar with and others maybe not so much. So there's the listing of the 5, and I've tried to put these as close to chronological as I can. Let's see if I still have a, yes, okay. Just wanted to make sure my pointer is still there. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Waldemar Haffkine and what has been called the Little Dreyfus Affair. So this is very early in the 20th century. Maybe a show of hands of all of you who are familiar with Waldemar Haffkine. Only a few. So I never heard of him before I started preparing for this talk. And I think you'll find that it's an interesting story, but it's also surfaced lately. I'm going to show in the references at the end a book that was published not very long ago, within the last 2 years, by Simon Schama. And you may be familiar with Simon Schama, the historian, because he did a series about history of the Jews that was quite popular on television. So his pandemic project was a book called Foreign Bodies, and that's where I learned about the story of Waldemar Haffkine. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story. The second of the 5 stories, Deutsche Physik, is the only physics-centric story of the bunch. The rest of them all are in some way medically related. Deutsche Physik is sort of a World War I, interwar, and World War II era story. Somewhat overlapping that, also associated with the Nazis and Nazi Germany, is the story of Freud and the Jewish science of psychoanalysis. I'll speak briefly about Stalin's doctor's plot, which was in the early part of 1950s. And then the last story, the COVID pandemic, and there I give credit again to Dr. Peter Hotez, who has published a book quite recently about anti-science. He also has published a journal article on anti-science and anti-Semitism. So I give a lot of the credit for this talk to him, at least to get some ideas for what might be appropriate stories to share. I have to go here. There we go. So let's go to the story of Waldemar Haffkine. Born in 1860 in Odessa, a young Jewish student growing up in Odessa, and also a member of the Jewish League for Self-Defense in Odessa. He was injured as a youth while defending a Jewish home during a pogrom, and as a result of that action, he was arrested, but he was later released because his mentor intervened. His mentor was the Jewish immunologist Ilya Mechnikov, who would go on to win the 1908 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in recognition of his work on immunity. So Haffkine worked with Mechnikov and learned about immunity. He was a microbiologist. He was not a medical doctor. That actually was a contributor to the hostility that later developed towards him. But he was an immunologist in the early days of immunology, and he can really be credited with saving the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individuals directly. And I think by extension, it's to his credit that we vaccinate today and that we understand the role that vaccination can play in preventing the spread of infectious disease. So Haffkine was granted his professional degree, but he couldn't get a professorship. Why? because this was the late 1880s in Russia, in the country where the Tsar had been assassinated in the early 1880s, and Jews were subjected to all sorts of bad things at that period. If you're interested in the history of the Jewish population of America, it's largely built on the foundation of Jews who fled Russia after the assassination of the Tsar in, I think, maybe 1882. I'm not sure exactly. But most Jews in this country are descendants of Jews who fled Russia following the pogroms that came about after the assassination of the Tsar. So Hafkin was refused a professorship. He was told that he could get one if he converted to Russian Orthodox, but he was actually quite a devout Jew. And so he left Russia and he emigrated to Switzerland and began working at the University of Geneva. And then he moved to Paris and he worked with Professor Metchnikoff and with Louis Pasteur. So he took up a post. The only available post was as a librarian. So here's a PhD immunologist, but he could only get a job as a librarian. He focused his research on developing a vaccine for cholera, and he produced an attenuated form of the bacterium that causes cholera, and he risked his own life in 1892 and performed a test of the cholera vaccine on himself. And he used a higher dose than what would be delivered to people, but he was really a brave guy and really focused on trying to help combat cholera. So he's working in Paris in 1892, and he wanted now to do a field test of this cholera vaccine, and he was going to do that in what was called Siam at the time, but the British ambassador in Paris convinced him instead to try out the cholera vaccine in India. And that was very important in Hafkin's life because he actually did try out the cholera vaccine in India. It was quite successful. And in 1900, Hafkin was naturalized as a British subject. And a nice quote that I read from the Jewish Chronicle, a magazine or newspaper of the time, said, "A Ukrainian Jew trained in the schools of European science saves the lives of Hindus and Mohammedans and is decorated by a descendant of William the Conqueror and Alfred the Great." I mean, quite a cosmopolitan story, if you will. And Joseph Lister, whom you know, also associated with immunology, dubbed Hafkin a savior of humanity. So everything's like poised to make this guy, at the top of the heap. However, anti-Semitism intervened, and so I have to tell you a little bit about the Dreyfus Affair. So the Dreyfus Affair, if you're not familiar with it, it's worth reading about because we understand the importance of judicial process in this country, and the Dreyfus Affair in France, sort of 1894 to 1906-ish, that was one of the most notable examples of miscarriage of justice and anti-Semitism. So in a nutshell, Dreyfus was a French Jewish artillery officer. He was convicted of treason for communicating military secrets to the Germans, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment under very harsh conditions on Devil's Island in French Guiana. And the French political class at the time was almost unanimously unfavorable towards him. The only problem with that was that he had nothing to do with the transfer of the secret documents. It was a false claim, and it was a show trial conducted by the military under closed quarters, and his family believed that he was innocent, but there was really no way to do anything about it because nobody could see any details of the trial. Eventually, the French writer Émile Zola was made aware of what was going on and worked hard on behalf of Dreyfus. He wrote an open letter to the president, a very famous open letter called J'accuse, and he denounced those who conspired against Dreyfus. There was a lot of anti-Semitism at that time in France. And this particular there were anti-Semitic riots in 20 French cities, riots in Algiers that resulted in several deaths, all over this debate about whether Dreyfus was innocent or guilty. And it was coverage of those anti-Semitic demonstrations by the journalist Theodor Herzl, which led to his establishment of modern Zionism, feeling that there was no safe place for Jews in Europe. And think about it, you had the problem in Russia following 1880, and now it's 1900 and problems in Central and Western Europe. There's nowhere to flee. And so he developed the concept of modern Zionism. So that's Dreyfus. But what about Haffkine? So Haffkine, who had worked very hard to get funding for his vaccine work, eventually was quite successful with vaccinating large groups of people. And in March of 1902, where he had developed a vaccine, I believe in this case for plague, there were 19 Indian villagers who died of tetanus after being vaccinated. So this was 19 out of 88 in a small village in India. And there was some evidence that this was all linked to one particular bottle of the vaccine. And there was a procedure for how to sterilize the bottles. And so a commission from the Indian government concluded that the source of contamination was this one vial, and there was an inquiry, and Haffkine was relieved of his position. He had to return to England, and this story, which was roughly contemporaneous with the Dreyfus affair, became known as the Little Dreyfus Affair. He lost his position, but he was later acquitted. It turns out that an assistant had used a dirty bottle cap and had not gone through the proper sterilization procedure, and that was the reason that the people contracted tetanus and died. So he was acquitted. He never got his job back, however. He never returned to the salary that he'd been promised. And so his story is one that's kind of been forgotten, although thanks to my friend Todd Thal and an article that he found, there's a play that was just written about him. So in addition to the book by Simon Schama, there's now a play about Haffkine. And so this story hopefully will be told more in the future. Haffkine was quite a Zionist himself, and he tried to follow the ideas of Herzl and establish a safe homeland for the Jews, but didn't go anywhere. So that's that story. Deutsche Physik, the only physics story in this tale tonight, gets its name from a 4-volume physics textbook by Lenard, who was a Nobel laureate in Germany. And he wrote this 4-volume physics textbook. I don't have a copy of it, and I don't know that it's been translated into English, but I'm not sure I would want it if it was available, even though I'm a book lover. The basic idea of that book was that modern theoretical physics was dominated by Jewish contributions and thus Jewish thinking. And there was an argument at that time, this is Germany in the early part of the 20th century, that all cultural output, even science, was a product of race and blood. And so specifically, Lenard and turns out his co-conspirator, if you will, Stark, of the Stark effect, the two of them were targeting quantum mechanics and relativity, and they found these to be overly abstract approaches to the universe that went against their more grounded sensibilities. They were both experimentalists, And I mean, the bottom line really is that they didn't understand modern physics. They didn't understand quantum mechanics. They didn't understand relativity. And so they blamed the Jews on this, Jewish science. And that turned into a big problem. That problem began because of German nationalism at the start of World War I. So at the beginning of World War I, German troops set fire to a library in the Netherlands, and the burning of the library led British scientists, including Bragg and Lord Rayleigh and J.J. Thomson, names familiar to most physicists. It led them to write a reaction to that. And then the Germans responded with a reaction to the reaction. And eventually, there was quite a battle between British English-speaking scientists and German-speaking scientists. And so German scientific authors were stopping the use of English. They didn't want to have their books translated into English. And there were a lot of declarations. So this was kind of the interwar period. And then there was the Treaty of Versailles, and the nationalistic feelings still ran high in Germany. And so Leonard wrote a pamphlet complaining about England. And in 1922, Walter Rathenau, a Jewish German politician, was assassinated. There were very strong nationalistic tendencies post-World War I, and the German government said that flags had to be flown at half-mast, and Leonard refused to do that. So his institute did not fly their flag at half-mast. So, of course, Einstein's views were a radical break from earlier theories, and many of you would recognize the individual next to Einstein there is Heisenberg. His theories about quantum mechanics were also quite a radical break. So Leonard and Stark were really opposed to this kind of science, but I think in part because they just didn't understand it. And they started harassing Heisenberg, who was not Jewish. He was referred to as a white Jew, suggesting that Jews are not white, of course. So they labeled Heisenberg a white Jew, and Heisenberg was quite an important scientist in this period. This is the interwar period. But quite interestingly, Heisenberg's grandfather and Himmler's father were in the same Bavarian hiking club. And so Heisenberg's mother phoned Himmler's mother and said, "Stop the attacks against my son." And that was the end of the attacks against Heisenberg. That didn't stop the attacks against Jewish scientists, but it did stop the attacks against Heisenberg. The attacks, though, certainly were focused in part on Einstein. I chose this picture specifically because here you see Einstein with Oppenheimer. The Nazis sponsored conferences and book burnings to denounce Einstein and his theories, and there was some kind of a book that was published called 100 Authors Against Einstein, published in 1931. Einstein had quite a wit. He replied that to defeat relativity, one did not need the word of 100 scientists. One just needed one fact. But there weren't any facts in that, of course. So Einstein's books were burned. This was quite a terrible situation. He was an internationalist and a pacifist. And, really, his mathematical approach to physics just was beyond the abilities of some of the experimentalists. Also, Leonard was the one who did the experiments. This is a science crowd, I can do this. He was the one who made the measurements of the photoelectric effect, and then Einstein explained them, and as you know, that's what Einstein received his Nobel Prize for, and Leonard didn't like that because he didn't understand the explanation, really, and he didn't buy into it, and he thought he'd gotten robbed about it. So Einstein was eventually told he really needed to leave Germany, and he was waiting and waiting, By the way, that 4-volume treatise, which gives its name to this whole movement, Deutsche Physik, that 4-volume treatise in the foreword talks about Japanese physics, Arabian physics, Negro physics, but the real wrath in that book is focused on Jewish physics. Einstein decided to leave Germany forever in 1932. His life was in danger. I don't think I appreciated that. There was a magazine with Einstein's picture and a caption that said, "Not yet hanged." That was the caption in the, I couldn't find a picture of that, but that's what I had read. There was a price on his head. Einstein was asked by a Paris-based correspondent, how did he feel about the fact that there was a price on his head? And he said, I really had no idea my head was worth all that. But he was on a lecture tour in the United States, and he didn't come back to Germany. So in April 1933, he expatriated, and this was a cartoon in a German periodical that said basically, good riddance. He's a crazy Asian thinking that he's a Prussian. Not that the story is so nice in this country, by the way. Einstein was never asked to participate in the Manhattan Project. He had this lifelong association with peace and socialist organizations. And my understanding is that the FBI files that have been declassified suggest that the U.S. government feared Einstein's association with those organizations. And allegedly, J. Edgar Hoover, did not want Einstein to be accepted in the United States. Here's a picture of him receiving his American citizenship in 1940. I'm going to skip over this if I can. Let's see if I can. Yeah, let's skip that one. There's just some images of Einstein, and he's speaking in that one, but in the images, suffice it to say, there is a Jewish candelabra. So there you can see there's a connection of Einstein with his Jewish roots, though he was not what I would call a practicing Jew. He certainly felt strongly about his Jewish identity. Let's see. Maybe. Let me turn that off, because maybe that's the
problem. In 1930, the world's most famous physicist, Albert Einstein, is met by adoring crowds in New York. He's just visiting, but before long, he and many other German Jews will be hoping to make a permanent home here. He's asked his opinion on prohibition. He doesn't drink, so he doesn't care. In California, he's greeted by excited cheerleaders. The next summer, he's back home in Germany, at his cottage outside Berlin. Einstein, seen here in pajamas with wife Elsa, fears his days in his beloved homeland are numbered.
So I just wanted you to get a flavor of that, and to get to see Einstein in his pajamas. So let me move on to this next Nazi era overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-science. This is focused on Sigmund Freud. So Freud was born he was not born in Vienna, but he spent much of his life in Vienna. And he experienced anti-Semitism personally quite a bit as a university student. He eventually left Austria just before the start of World War II, after the Anschluss, after the Germans took over Austria, and he also had to flee for his life. But again, there was an overlap with anti-science. I think this is true in the case of the theoretical physicists as well. they were excluded from the mainstream activities in their fields. So they kind of gravitated to something else. And in the case of the physicists, they gravitated to working in relativity and quantum mechanics. In the case of psychoanalysis, they were kind of excluded from conventional medical fields of research, and so they formed their own cliques and developed their own science, if you will. Freud actually said that the inclusion of Jung, who was not Jewish, in the Freud circle was what Freud felt would save psychoanalysis from being disregarded as Jewish science, because they had Jung in their group. But Jung later split from them, and I think Jung actually had some significant anti-Semitism associated with his later career. The group that of Viennese physicians that Freud gathered together every Wednesday afternoon to kind of lay the groundwork of psychoanalysis, that group was critical, and that group then went on to become the group that's pictured here in 1922. And every single individual in that committee was Jewish, with the exception of Ernest Jones. He went on to marry somebody who was Jewish because his circle of friends and acquaintances and colleagues was all of these Jews. I couldn't resist this picture. Here's a picture of Freud, age 16, with his mother. I mean, you're just supposed to speculate about, what's going on there. But the Nazis were pretty opposed to this whole psychoanalysis because it was Jewish science. On the other hand, it was apparently working. So they created Nazi psychotherapy and said it had nothing to do with Freud. I mean, it was fairly blatant, trying to capture the science, but not to give credit to the Jews. Let's see, what did I want to... let me move on here. Freud also not a really practicing Jew as such, but very steeped in his Jewish heritage. He fled Austria because of Ernest Jones. Ernest Jones was in England and managed to convince Freud that he needed to leave. Freud was able to leave. He was dying of jaw cancer at the time that he left. He was in agony. He only lasted some months after he went to England, but he was able to die peacefully, I suppose you could call it. His couch is actually in London. It's not in Vienna because the couch went with him. Freud had four elderly sisters. They didn't have the same kind of power and influence, and they died in concentration camps. So let's see. And I actually had an audio clip of him. I'm going to skip over that. And let's see the video clip just for a minute. So this was done in a suburb of Vienna.
My father is here,
and this is his
with
daughter,
a very
Alma.
old friend of his who already went to school with him in Vienna. He later became an archaeologist, professor of archaeology in Rome. He used to come to Vienna once a year in the autumn and then inspected the new additions to my father's antique collection, and they stayed great friends all their lives. He was especially nice, lovable man. In this picture, neither of these two men knew that they were photographed.
I think that's quite interesting. I guess he hated the thought of being photographed. So that's the only movie, I think, that exists of Freud. And there was that one audio clip that I skipped over also. The fourth story, I'm not going to spend much time on it. This is the Stalin doctor's plot. This was state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and it targeted mostly Jewish doctors. Stalin created this fiction that these people were out to assassinate important figures in the communist government. And after Stalin's death in 1953, which prevented the really worst extremes of enacting the doctor's plot, because Stalin died, so that was it for the plot. But Khrushchev gave a talk in 1956, and that talk was leaked out of the Soviet Union by a member of the Israeli intelligence organization. And in that speech, Khrushchev said that Stalin had created this whole plot to purge the government of unwanted people. And he just was planning to blame these doctors and then use that to do all sorts of worse stuff. I like this quotation from the historian Hannah Arendt, who says totalitarianism in power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies, with those crackpots and fools whose lack of intelligence makes them good followers. So, you know, I also wanted to include this because it's a little bit of balance, right? We had the extreme right-wing Nazis stories with the Jewish science and the Jewish psychoanalysis, and now the extreme left wing, if you will. So there's a cartoon that was published just before Stalin died. So this was part of the Stalin doctor's plot. This was published in January of '53 in a Soviet magazine, and you can see that there's like a mask on this medical doctor, and revealed underneath is the stereotypical Jewish tropes. So that's all I wanted to say about that story. I'm going to close with this story because this is the modern story of overlap of anti-Semitism and anti-science, and this is the one that I learned about in large part through Professor Peter Hotez. So I don't know how well you can read that poster, but that poster comes from an organization called the Goyim Defense League. It's a very extreme right-wing organization. These posters were put all over the place in Florida, among other places, and it claims that every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. It identifies a dozen or so individuals as Jews, including the chair of the director of the CDC, and it just goes all the way down the list. It talks about how Jews are benefiting from COVID because of manufacturing vaccines and making money from that, and just pretty horrible stuff. I want to show you a few other things from the right-wing anti-Semitic tropes associated with COVID. There you see a Trojan horse with a COVID virus head on it. And inside is kind of, again, the tropes of the globalist Jews. And this showed up on a far right-wing social media site. Another claim on that same site is that China was targeted by a Jewish bioweapon designed to assert control over China. Oftentimes, George Soros is linked with this coronavirus story. The Rothschilds are seen weighing money as more important than people and making money out of this. Misappropriation of Holocaust symbols, yellow Jewish stars, other Nazi symbols, these all came up associated with vaccination. Medical brown shirts was something that came up. Face masks with swastikas on them, vaccine syringes shaped like swastikas, And Dr. Peter Hotez, who I'm going to speak about a little more momentarily, was described as, quote, a living Mengele. So, I mean, this is just incredible in our country. So, two Jewish doctors in particular that I want to make mention of, Dr. Peter Hotez, who's in Texas and who's a friend of my friend Richard Skolnick. And Richard, I'm quite honored to say, connected me with Peter Hotez. And, you know, he's been quite eloquent on this topic of the overlap of anti-Semitism and anti-science, and about the problem of anti-science in this country. Both Peter Hotez and Dr. Gavin Yameh gave chilling accounts of negative reactions to their statements that more people should get vaccinated against COVID-19, and they were targeted specifically because they were Jewish, and they were accused of being Nazis, which is also incredible. There's Dr. Yameh. The first time that as a Jewish physician you're called a Nazi, it's a real shock. It's a punch to the gut. Well, no kidding. I mean, really. And Dr. Hotez has said anti-science is now a leading killer of Americans, and hundreds of thousands of American deaths are attributed to anti-science, and there is significant overlap with anti-Semitism there. So I think I wanted to give Peter Hotez, I think, the last word here. So we're going to play this clip.
My name is Dr. Peter Hotez. I'm a professor of pediatrics and molecular virology, Baylor College of Medicine, where I also co-direct our Center for Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital, and I work on developing vaccines for poverty-related neglected diseases, but also now coronavirus vaccines for the last 10 years, including a hopefully low-cost COVID-19 vaccine that's being scaled for production in India with our collaborators at Biological E in Hyderabad.
This was done in March of 2021.
Right now, all of our vaccines are in various stages of clinical trials, including the COVID-19 vaccine, and some of our vaccines we never got the funding to really continue. An example of that is our SARS vaccine. We made that, manufactured that vaccine, but we never got an investor to move it into phase 1 clinical trials. My op-ed article in the LA Times really focused on the fact that despite best efforts by the policymakers, at the end of the day, we still do not have a lot of vaccines to offer for low and middle income countries, especially for Africa. We need to be able to have vaccines made locally for local distribution. So Africa, for instance, could make not only their own COVID vaccines, but for vaccines of regional importance on the African continent that are not necessarily global and therefore will never be made by the big pharma companies for diseases such as schistosomiasis. It affects 40 million girls and women living in extreme poverty. It causes pain, bleeding, social stigma. It's a risk factor for HIV/AIDS, and yet nobody hardly even knows about it. And if female genital schistosomiasis were affecting, up to half the girls and women in you name it, Los Angeles or Paris, we would never tolerate it as a society. But
so I think you get the gist of his of his passion, his life work to develop inexpensive vaccines for third world countries, and to have this individual attacked the way he has been attacked because of his Jewishness and because of the science he works on is simply intolerable in my mind. So I'll just close by saying I believe that America is indeed blessed to have an environment in which Jewish scientists and Jews in general can thrive. So there's a symbol of Jewishness and there's a symbol of science. And what we don't want is this, and that's the anti-science, anti-Semitism story as best I could deliver it, starting with vaccine development, ending with vaccine development, but appealing to you as potential allies in this important fight. Let's see, go vote. Sorry, I'm not being too political here, but go vote. I put that on there because I feel important that's an important part of how we combat some of this. And I'll leave this question on here. Maybe I'll be able to go back. So there's some acknowledgments and references. I alluded to the article by Peter Hotez on anti-science and anti-Semitism, his book called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, which you can get out of the Mesa Public Library, Foreign Bodies by Simon Schama. You can also get there a few other books that you're welcome to talk to me about because they're part of my library, many websites that I looked at, and I thank you for your attention. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we'll take a few questions and then